Every Sunday morning, the white steeple of St. Mary's Church rose gently against the soft glow of sunrise, casting long shadows across the quiet town of Brookhaven. Families arrived in clusters, children tugging on their parents' hands, and elderly couples greeting each other with warm smiles and nods. The wooden pews slowly filled, the scent of old hymn books and burning candles filling the air. On this particular morning, the choir was already warming up with gentle harmonies as parishioners settled in. Laughter and whispered greetings flowed through the aisles until the heavy wooden doors creaked open and a hush began to spread. An old man stood there, tall but slightly stooped. His shoulders were square beneath a well-worn gray suit, and his hands, though gnarled by time, held firmly to a polished cane. His white hair was neatly combed, and a small pin, a Marine Corps emblem, gleamed softly on his lapel. His name was Gerald Thompson. Most in the congregation didn't recognize him. To the children, he was just a stranger. To some adults, perhaps a quiet memory, a ghost from the past. It had been years since Mr. Thompson had stepped inside this church. He had lived just outside of town in a modest house, keeping mostly to himself. Many believed he had no family, no friends left. Fewer knew that decades ago, Gerald had served in the Pacific and bore the scars of war silently, without a need for recognition. This morning, he walked slowly but with purpose. Each step echoed faintly as he made his way down the center aisle, his eyes fixed on an empty pew near the front. The congregation watched in silence, unsure of what to say or do. Some glanced at one another with curiosity. Others simply bowed their heads, unsure whether to acknowledge the man or let him pass in peace. The choir, still rehearsing near the altar, hadn't yet noticed him, but someone had. Emily Whitaker, one of the sopranos, caught a glimpse of the man as he took his seat. Her voice caught in her throat. She had seen that face before, in an old photo her grandfather used to keep in a box of war medals. Her grandfather and Mr. Thompson had served together. Her heart skipped a beat. She leaned toward the choir director, barely whispering, "That's him. That's Sergeant Thompson." What happened next would transform an ordinary Sunday morning into a moment of reverence, one the entire church would never forget. Sergeant Gerald Thompson sat quietly in the pew, his cane resting against the worn wood beside him. He didn't glance around or seek attention. His gaze remained forward, focused on the stained glass window above the altar, a scene of Saint Michael, the warrior angel, sword raised and wings outstretched. Perhaps it reminded him of something, or someone, from long ago. In the choir loft, Emily Whitaker's heart was pounding. Her eyes were fixed on the man below. She remembered the stories her grandfather used to tell, tales of courage, of jungle patrols, of nights filled with fear and brotherhood. He always spoke of Thompson, the sergeant who kept everyone together when everything else fell apart. She had always assumed those stories belonged to the past, to memory, not flesh and blood. But now, here he was, sitting alone in the second row, quiet, unnoticed, forgotten. Not for long. Emily turned to the choir director, her voice shaking but firm. "Sir, I know this is unplanned, but I need to request a change in the program." The director, a gentle man in his 60s, looked puzzled. "What do you mean, Emily?" She swallowed hard. "That man sitting near the front, that's Sergeant Thompson. My grandfather served with him. He's a decorated Marine. He's a hero, and no one even knows he's here." The director's eyes followed her gesture, narrowing slightly. Then he gave a small nod. "What do you want to sing?" he asked. Without hesitation, she answered, "Eternal Father, strong to save." It was a hymn traditionally sung for sailors and military service members, a solemn, powerful prayer for protection at sea and in battle. The choir hadn't rehearsed it for months, but every voice in that loft knew it by heart. The director raised a hand, signaling the organist to pause. The regular Sunday hymn was quietly set aside. There was no announcement, no explanation. And yet, as the opening chords of Eternal Father began to echo through the church, something shifted. The congregation looked up, startled. The melody was familiar, but unexpected. Heads turned. Whispers spread. A few older men exchanged knowing glances. One of them, a Korean War veteran, removed his cap and stood. Gerald Thompson's brow furrowed. He looked up toward the choir loft, confused. Then slowly, as the first verse soared above him, realization began to dawn in his eyes. This was for him. Emily's voice rose above the others, clear, trembling with emotion. "Oh, hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea." The words wrapped around the old Marine like an embrace. His hand, shaking slightly, reached up to touch the lapel of his coat, where the small eagle, globe, and anchor pin glinted in the light. In that moment, the church became still, not with silence, but with reverence. There were no spotlights, no applause, just voices singing a sacred tribute. Just a man sitting alone, who was no longer alone. As the hymn continued, something indescribable spread through the sanctuary, a stillness wrapped in awe. People who had come simply to attend a Sunday service now found themselves standing, one by one, almost instinctively. The atmosphere felt less like a church, and more like a sacred moment in history being rewritten before their eyes. Gerald Thompson sat motionless, his hands trembling in his lap. The choir's voices swelled with each verse, rising higher, fuller, not polished, not perfect, but rich with something deeper than harmony, respect. The kind of respect that doesn't have to be taught, only remembered. A few rows back, a young father stood and whispered to his son, "That man helped protect this country. This song, it's for him." The boy, barely old enough to understand the weight of the moment, still nodded solemnly. Near the rear of the sanctuary, an older woman clutched her rosary with shaking hands. She remembered Gerald. Not well, but enough. She remembered the day the town put his name on the wall outside City Hall, and the silence that followed when he didn't come home for 2 whole years. She had always assumed he'd moved away. She never imagined he was still here, living quietly just a few blocks from where she now sat. Back in the choir loft, Emily kept her eyes fixed on the man below. Her voice cracked on the 3rd verse, and she let the others carry it for a moment. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept singing. This was for her grandfather, too, for all the men like him who never got a moment like this. Then, something remarkable happened. Gerald Thompson stood. No one asked him to. No one expected it. But as the final verse began, he slowly pushed himself to his feet. His cane shook slightly in his hand, but he held his back straight, just as he had on the parade grounds of Camp Lejeune decades ago. His chin lifted. His eyes, now shimmering, scanned the room. And the choir, noticing his movement, rose with him. Then the front pews, then the rest of the congregation. Within seconds, the entire church was on its feet. It was no longer just a tribute, it was a salute. As the final line rang out, "Protect them wheresoe'er they go." The organ held the last note, and the choir fell into silence. The only sound that remained was the quiet sniffles of dozens of people wiping away tears. Gerald remained standing, his eyes closed now. He wasn't thinking of medals or parades. He wasn't remembering orders or battle plans. He was remembering voices, laughter in foxholes, cries from wounded friends, the roar of helicopters, the crash of waves, the long nights of waiting, always waiting. And then, peace. In that quiet church, beneath stained glass and warm sunlight, Gerald Thompson finally felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not glory, not attention. Belonging. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Emily stepping down from the choir loft. She walked slowly, reverently, and approached him with both hands clasped in front of her. "Sergeant Thompson," she said softly, "my grandfather used to tell me about you. He said you were the bravest man he ever knew." Gerald looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened. "What was his name?" he asked. "Private Daniel Whitaker." The name hit him like a gust of wind. Gerald's lips parted, but no words came. "I just wanted you to know," Emily continued, "that you're not forgotten. Not today. Not ever." And for the first time in a long time, the old Marine smiled, not because he felt honored, but because he felt seen. Truly, finally, seen. After the final note faded into the rafters, silence lingered. Not the awkward kind, but one filled with reverence, reflection, and something else entirely. Gratitude. The choir slowly took their seats. Parishioners returned to their pews, but no one dared speak above a whisper. It felt almost like the church itself was holding its breath, honoring something sacred that had just taken place within its walls. Gerald Thompson eased himself back down, his cane resting once more by his side. His hands still trembled slightly, but his face had changed. The deep lines etched by years of solitude now softened, even lifted, by something lighter. He wasn't used to moments like this. He had long accepted that his time in uniform was a distant memory to most. A chapter closed, buried under years of quiet routine. But now, that chapter had been reopened, reread aloud, and respected. As the priest approached the pulpit, he paused to glance at Gerald. Then, instead of beginning his prepared sermon, he folded the paper quietly and spoke from the heart. "Before we go any further," he said gently, "let us acknowledge that sometimes grace enters a room not through words but through presence. This morning, a man who once gave his strength to protect ours walked through these doors and reminded us what humility, courage, and quiet service look like." Murmurs of agreement swept through the room. A few heads bowed. Some wiped tears. A few men near the back, veterans themselves, exchanged nods, eyes glistening. The priest continued, "We often honor heroes in marble and metal. But today, we honored one with voices and silence. May we never forget the power of both." After the service, people didn't rush out like they usually did. Instead, they gathered near the front, waiting. Gerald, unsure what to do, stood slowly, expecting to slip away unnoticed. But the moment he turned, a little boy ran up to him, holding out a homemade drawing of an American flag. "My grandpa was a soldier," the boy said. "He's in heaven, but Mom said you're kind of like him." Gerald knelt, slowly, painfully, and accepted the drawing like it was a medal. "Thank you, son," he whispered, his voice thick. "You tell your mom she raised a fine patriot." Behind the boy, others began to approach. Couples, veterans, teens, elderly women. They shook his hand. They thanked him. They listened. Someone invited him to lunch at the community center. Another asked if he'd speak at the high school for Veterans Day. And Emily just stayed close, her presence a quiet tether to the moment. By the time Gerald finally stepped out of the church, the sun had risen higher in the sky, and something about the town looked different. Not physically, but spiritually. It felt warmer, softer, more aware. Word of what happened would ripple through Brookhaven before sundown. Photos would be shared, the story told and retold. And in homes across the town, children would ask who the old Marine at church was, and parents would explain with pride. Because sometimes, one quiet man can awaken the memory of an entire town. Later that evening, as the golden light faded over Brookhaven, Gerald Thompson sat alone on his front porch. His old wooden rocking chair creaked gently beneath him. A folded newspaper sat beside a cooling cup of tea, but Gerald wasn't reading. He was simply staring at the horizon, the same direction he'd looked so many times before, back when orders came through radios and courage was measured by how still your hands stayed under fire. Yet today, courage had taken a different form. Today, it had looked like a trembling hand opening a church door, a voice raised in song, a congregation standing in silence, a boy offering a flag drawn with crayons. He thought about how many years had passed since he'd worn the uniform, about how often he'd wondered if anyone even remembered the name Sergeant Gerald Thompson. The world had moved on. People had moved on. And maybe that was how it was supposed to be. But not today. Today proved something different, something he hadn't dared believe anymore. That sometimes memory does find its way home. That sometimes the quietest heroes are the ones most worthy of a song. His hand reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small folded drawing the little boy had given him. Red, white, and blue lines crisscrossed on thin paper with the words, "Thank you for protecting us," scribbled in the corner. Gerald smiled, a deep, quiet smile, and in that moment, he didn't feel forgotten. He didn't feel alone. He felt like he belonged again. And that, more than medals, more than speeches, was enough.
If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you with us. Each day we share quiet moments that remind us what still matters. You can subscribe below to join us.